These are the boots that I wore for an 8-month walk. This is after I reached my destination. I walked for about 8 months across Europe from the Hook of Holland to Istanbul. As my introductors said, I was following in the footsteps of a previous traveller, the late travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor. There's been a big resurgence of interest in his books at the moment. I don't really have time to talk about him or his journey. In fact, I don't really have a lot of time to talk about my journey. But it carried me 2,500 miles through Holland, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, ending up in Istanbul. And this journey is really too long, it's too densely layered in my mind to tell to you chronologically. Walking is slow. It's really, really slow. And telling the story of an 8-month walk in less than 15 minutes kind of defeats the object of walking in the first place, so I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do is offer you a series of insights that I got from doing this walk, and hopefully inspire some of you to do something equally as slow in the future. So, first it's important to say why. Why walk for 8 months? What's the point? You want to go to Istanbul, why not fly? I got that a lot. I think it really depends on what you want out of life. If you want to get to your destination quickly, without thinking about it too much, then traveling on foot is a massive waste of time. But if you look at life as a process of gathering experience, gathering stories, gathering memories, which is all we're left with in the end, then rushing blindly from one place to another actually doesn't make a lot of sense. That was one of the paradoxical lessons of my journey. Traveling quickly is a waste of time. You miss all the good stuff, the rich detail in the fabric of the world. I'll say more about that in a bit. But it's also important to say how. How do you plan for such a trip? Well, my answer to that is very simple. You don't, if you can possibly avoid it. Planning is fatal. I knew where I was going. I had my route mapped out, as you saw. That was important. But I didn't use Google Maps to study every inch of terrain. I didn't use the internet to research everywhere I was going. I certainly did not use guidebooks whose function is to tell you exactly what to expect. In an age of total information, I preferred to travel in the spirit of wide-eyed discovery, some might say naivety. Research would only have spoilt the surprise, the joy, the spontaneity of what lay around the next corner. And it's also important to say that I didn't train physically for this. I'm not a specialized walker. I'm not an athlete. You don't need specialized knowledge or specialized equipment to do something like this. You just need a pair of boots, a rucksack, and trust that the world will look after you, because it normally does. Adjusting to the slowness of walking pace required a mental as well as a physical shift. Our culture is completely obsessed with speed, and for the first days or even weeks of my walk, it was intensely frustrating to see a distant steeple on a horizon that I was heading towards at the end of a long day stubbornly stay the same size, and stay the same size, and stay the same size, and stay the same size, no matter how fast I tried to get to it. Bicycles passed me with speed and grace that I envied, but at least recognized as just a faster version of what I was doing. Cars were so fast, they seemed completely incomprehensible. It sounds ridiculous, but it took me a long time to embody the fact that I wasn't in competition with things traveling faster than me. I was engaged in a very different activity for very different reasons. But once your brain slows down to walking pace, once the rhythm of your thoughts synchronizes with the rhythm of your steps, you become aware of a different order of fascinations. You notice things that you wouldn't see, you wouldn't have access to traveling at any other speed or in any other way. The way that landscape gradually changes rather than jumping from one thing to another. The way that accents and dialects and cultures and attitudes and local tastes in food and beer gradually evolve. They merge into each other at such an incremental pace that often it isn't possible to tell where one thing ends and the other begins. People asked me if I was bored traveling on my own. I was seldom bored. I won't say never, but I was seldom bored because walking is a process of constant change. Nothing ever stays the same. People also asked me if I was lonely walking on my own like that. I experienced solitude, but not loneliness. They're very different things. Loneliness has connotations of sadness, whereas solitude can be a very liberating, empowering thing. Walking exposes you to everything. You're very vulnerable as a walker, which is why this idea of trust is so important. I was exposed to wind, to rain, to sleet and hail, to dismal suburbs that never seemed to end, to traffic, to exhaust fumes, to every rise and fall in topography. Throughout Eastern Europe, I was exposed to occasional dog attacks. The general rule seems to be that the further east you go in Europe, the people get nicer and the dogs get nastier. I started my journey in the coldest part of Europe in the winter, so I was exposed to snow and intense cold, and later in the hottest part of Europe in the summer to dust and intense heat. In the mountains of Romania, I crossed tracks with a wolf, and in the forests of Bulgaria, I came face to face with a wild boar. I was exposed to all those things. But I was also exposed almost every day to those rare moments of beauty that you simply wouldn't see going any other way. I was exposed to people. I should say now that not once in 8 months of walking through countries whose cultures I didn't know, whose languages I barely spoke, not once did I encounter hostility or aggression from another human being. I was never once intimidated by anyone I met. I encountered suspicion, but this was almost always allayed by the simple act of looking people in the eye, shaking hands, and smiling. In potentially unfamiliar surroundings, this is a faster route to acceptance than memorizing pages of a phrase book. And my normal strategy in order to cross that threshold between me and the cultures that I was walking through, say, arriving in a village in the middle of the Slovakian countryside, or on the Great Hungarian Plain, or in the green vales of Transylvania, arriving as a stranger. My strategy was this, and sorry to say it is much easier for a man to do this than a woman, sadly, to go to the nearest shabby-looking bar, sit down, endure the initial baffled stares, wait. Almost invariably, within half an hour, a drunken farmer would be slapping me on the back and shaking my hand and buying me palinka or dzojka or rakia or whatever they drank in those parts, bellowing conversationally in my ear. I couldn't necessarily understand a word of this, but the meaning was clear. You are welcome in our village. Don't be a stranger. I learned that people enjoy being kind. They enjoy being generous and hospitable. It would have been rude to disappoint them. I was offered accommodation in the houses of strangers the length of the continent. At first, I did this through the couch surfing network, which is where people offer a bed or a sofa or a mattress on the floor in exchange for a vague promise that you will do the same for them at some point in the future. But the further east I got, the more spontaneous these offers became. And again, that's why it's important not to over-organize these things, because that takes the spontaneity, the possibility out of these encounters. I slept in a Hungarian school, a Romanian nunnery, a Bulgarian monastery, and a Transylvanian psychiatric hospital. When I wasn't offered accommodation in the homes of generous people I met, I had to find ways of sleeping out, sleeping wild. This wasn't homelessness exactly, because the walker has homes everywhere. I learned that paradoxical entitlement that the rough sleeper has, where their lack of rights somehow grants them greater rights to be in the landscape than anyone else. So I learned to sleep in secluded woodlands, in ruined Gothic castles along the River Rhine, which is a very upmarket version of rough sleeping. I slept in abandoned hunting hides in the forests of Austria, the occasional mountain cabin. I bought a tent, much like this in Budapest, and I camped for the last 4 countries of my walk. So I can look back and see this journey as a map of temporary homes that I moved into, made myself comfortable in, and then left for other travelers to find. It was also a map of very different types of terrain. I didn't have one dedicated footpath taking me there. Each day's journey became a series of tactical decisions of how to get from one place to another. So I walked along cycle paths and pavements and footpaths. I followed two great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube. I crossed by mountain trails through the Carpathian Mountains. In the snow of Bavaria, I learnt to walk in deep snow, taking one step forward and a half step back, sometimes sinking up to my knees. And when I got to the Black Sea coast, I took off those boots I showed you, hung them around my neck, and kept the sea to my left so I couldn't get lost, and walked barefoot along the hard sand of the tide line to the border with Turkey. But I also had to walk along motorway verges. I had to walk through suburbs and industrial estates. I had to trespass in that strange interzone that isn't rural and isn't urban, and you don't really feel like you have a right to be in. This wasn't necessarily a picturesque journey. In the mountains of Romania, in the Carpathian Mountains, sitting by a glacial lake covered with ice, as the sun went down over snow-capped peaks, the ground before me covered in purple crocuses, and the only sound rivers hissing down towards the tree line below. In that place, I had this realization that the road I'd followed since leaving the ferry terminal at the Hook of Holland 5 months before, that road had brought me to this point. It was only one road, a road with many twists and turns and convolutions, but still only one road, and it led to this place directly, if followed a certain way. The last thing I want to mention is the process of arrival. If you ever do a journey like this, and it doesn't have to be 8 months, because actually walking for 8 days isn't so dissimilar. It requires the same mental shift, the same resetting, the same sense of going slow. If you do a journey like this, then be prepared for the enormous disappointment of reaching your goal. When I got to Istanbul, to the glittering waters of the Bosphorus, the end of Europe and the start of Asia, and saw the mosques glinting in the sunlight, the place that I'd been dreaming about through the snows of Bavaria, through the dust and the heat of Bulgaria, when I actually got there after 2,500 miles, I experienced less triumph than a feeling of enormous loss, a great sense of sadness that this process that had brought me so much joy was now at an end. But this sense of loss started to diminish once I stopped seeing the journey as a whole in linear terms with one beginning and one end. About 10 days before I got to Istanbul, I'd crossed the Turkish border. I'd found the first Turkish village, taken a seat, as was my habit, outside the nearest tea shop, ordered a tea and sat there and waited. And a man had pulled up his chair to my table. He spoke good English. We got into conversation. He bought me 3 cups of tea, one after the other, as a symbol of welcome and acceptance. When I tried to pay, he pushed the money away. When I tried to thank him, he said something I'll always remember. "Don't thank me. The way we see it, you have walked all this way just to meet us." And in that moment, I saw that my journey had never been a means to an end, but an end in itself. Every person that I met, every stone and tree, every stream and hill, that had been my true point of destination. It hadn't been one journey, but multiple journeys with multiple points of arrival. And if we can somehow extend that vision and see the whole world like this, and see our whole lives in these terms, then I think the map of the world becomes so much more interesting and so much richer. Thank you.